Hi, this is John Beatty, and you're listening to the Captain America Comic Book Fans Podcast.
Greetings, Cap fans, and welcome to episode 43 of the Captain America Comic Book Fans Podcast. I am your host, Rick Verbanis, and as always, I am joined by the best gosh darn co-host out there, Mr. Bob Lucius. Bob? Yo.
What's up, Rick? Rick, this is like, I hope I can make it through today's interview because I am staring down the barrel of a hurricane coming at me.
Oh, no.
But you know what? Nothing gets in the way of a podcast.
Nothing gets in the way of Captain America fans.
Yeah, that's right. So I'm going to do what it takes to get through this just for the fans.
All right. So if power cuts out in the middle of this, we understand.
Yep.
All right. So you're not even going to ask me why I went with yo?
Why'd you go with yo today, Rick?
Well, I'm glad you asked, Bob.
What's up with yo that?
Well, that's a very common hello in the 80s. And considering we've got Mr. John Beatty on as a guest today, and he was the anchor on Captain America in the early 80s, I wanted to stick with the theme. So I went with yo.
Yeah. I mean, it was a bit of I had a sniff of late 70s there. It seemed a bit of Vinnie Barbarella and Rocky Balboa, but I was
Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. You know, why do I have to chase these chickens? I don't understand. What are you talking about? All right.
Oh man of many talents.
Yes. So Bob, I don't know if we mentioned this before. Well, we've been mentioning let's just talk about the next episode before we get into this episode. Next episode 44. I'm excited for Bob. I'm excited because it'll be our very first listener Q&A show. Yeah,
this is sort of, you sort of proposed this and I was like, I think you've got something there. I mean, it's an ingenious concept.
Well, the questions are coming in. How do you get your questions in? Well, funny you should ask because it's really two ways. Easy. You can, and this is the preferred way. Okay, get this. Go to our Anchor homepage. Right, the link is in the podcast. The link is in the posts and social media. Go there, and you can record your question. And if we, maybe you'll be lucky enough to be actually played in this upcoming episode 44. Or the other way is, you can post it answer one of our posts on the Facebook page where we ask for questions as well. And the questions are coming in. These are pretty interesting questions. You know what, Bob? Here's an example. We can answer. Okay. Utility belt with pouches or no?
Oh yeah. This has been a point of contention.
Should Cap have utility belt with pouches or no?
Yeah.
Now don't answer now. Don't answer now. Save it for next week.
Yeah.
All right. And we'll but those are the types of things you can call in. Let's have some fun. Yeah. Let's have some fun. Focus on Captain America.
That's a good one. I'm not gonna be able to sleep tonight.
You're gonna be thinking of your answer.
Yes,
or you can be devil's advocate. Like whatever answer I give, you're gonna be like, well, no, Rick, don't you understand? He needs the pouches because how else is he going to get out his cap laser? Whatever.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. It's a good question.
All right. Thank you. All right. So let's get to our guest today. And we have a fun conversation with Mr. John Beatty.
John Beatty. I can't wait for this.
All right, Bob. So our guest today has been a prolific ink artist spanning decades, going back 40 years. He's worked on classic stories that everyone seems to know, such as Secret Wars back in 1985. He did the Punisher miniseries in 1986. He worked on several Batman stories, including classic ones like Year 3. And then there was those Crimson Mist and Bloodstorm Elseworld vampire stories. He helped launch Legends of the Dark Knight. He had a nice run on Justice League and Superman titles, but of course, we're most excited today to speak with him on his impressive run on Captain America. So we're talking to none other than John Beatty. So John, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, guys. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. And it's funny, we spoke with Ron Garney recently, and it seems like the two of you have a lot in common, right? So as a kid, both of your favorite comic book characters was Captain America.
Mhm.
You both eventually got to work on your favorite character. And then you both received help from Mike Zeck early in your career. So let's start with Cap being your favorite character. I read a post on your Instagram page where you shared a story about
Right.
how you first got into Cap, and
Mhm.
you said you were on a family trip. Your mom bought you some superhero comics to read on the trip, and one of them was Cap 157, which
Right.
was introduced you to the character. So talk about why this issue made such an impact on you.
Um, that's a good question. I don't, it's hard to like really pinpoint why. Um, but I think visually the just the costume design of Captain America is so powerful. It looks good from every angle that you draw it from, or that it can be viewed from. And not only did I just enjoy the cover with all the elements going on, um, Cap's like the Vipers coming at him, the Falcon's already like down on the ledge hanging off, and the ledge is beginning to crumble under Cap. So there's this whole impending, like the bad guys, gonna win or something. But so I think, okay, that's how the story might open. But if memory serves me correct, the splash page has Cap just taking care of about 3 or 4, maybe 5, like street thugs. But
Mhm.
it's this back view of him drawn by Sal Buscema, and it's got the classic, uh, muscled Captain America with this great costume on, which I said from any angle, it just looks great. So even a back view on a splash page was just really dynamic, and something about that caught my attention.
And from there on, did you always kind of have an interest in Cap?
No, I really didn't adapt to superhero comics till a little bit later. And that same story, I think I mentioned, I got the little digest books of Charles Schultz Peanuts and
Mhm.
Dennis the Menace, and I kind of followed those more because I wanted to be a comic strip artist. And eventually, what happened, I think it was at my neighbor's, they had a garage sale or something, and he had like a box of books and or comic books, and it was like $20, and it was probably, I don't know, I want to say he probably had 80 to 100 books, or it was a good amount for $20. And this is when I was about 14, and I think I may have borrowed the money from my mom, or just asked her, hey, can I buy these comic books for $20 up the street? And I think she gave it to me. That's one thing too. I'll quickly go to is, my parents were very supportive of
Mhm.
my art endeavor. You'll always hear that, like, where, you want to be an artist, your parents always discourage you. No, don't do that. And there is some truth to that too, by the
Mhm.
way, just to be clear. But so I don't remember any Captain Americas per se being in that, but there was Avengers and stuff. So Cap was around, and every book that had Cap in it, I just seemed to focus, my attention focused more on his visual than any of the other characters. And maybe just the attitude that he was portrayed by the writers and the artists, the heroic look, the
Mhm.
manner that they had him speak and stuff like that. So the acting that the character had.
I was actually going to ask you about that event with the box of comic books, and if there are any titles that you found particularly memorable. But I want to follow up on that because
Mhm.
I like what you just said about sort of the. I think you characterized it as the acting, but the persona of the
Right.
character. So in addition to the visual aesthetics of it, and that's really interesting. I'd like to hear a little bit more about your thoughts about
Right.
that.
The more I got to know Cap and be interested in him, I of course had to backtrack to see, I mean, I knew a little bit about the character, but um I remember and I didn't really click with Jack Kirby's art like right away. It was one of those things that I just didn't understand. It was like, what is this? But going back in the timeline and seeing how Steve Rogers became Captain America with the super soldier serum, and that it was kind of, I guess, also, as a kid, I would stay up and watch the old war movies on TV, on my like small black and white TV set that my dad had. So I'd be up at 2 a.m. There'd be like an old war movie on Battle of the Bulge or something, and I would watch that. So that World War II connection with Cap and then that history, it was just kind of interest to me. So it was something also believable, that this character could actually exist in the real world. Whereas some characters just, they're a little further out there. So he was more grounded in reality for me to a degree, you know. But yeah, and then just like I said, his attitude of, here we are, right before the 4th of July, and it's like, it just seemed like it was a good representation, and especially, as knowing when he was created, of, something that Americans could get behind.
John, I got to tell you, I'm 53, right? And I've been reading Cap comics for a long, long time, but I have never put that sort of logic together in my head. And you just made it click for me, which is amazing because, we're still learning stuff about Cap, and guests like you sort of bring a whole new perspective. But I used to watch all those World War II movies like religiously.
Right. Yeah.
When I was a kid, and I never made that connection about that was an aspect of Cap that I really found interesting to me. And it sort of meshed with that other interest of mine. It never even occurred to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's it's like I said, going back and looking at the older comics, and not the ones from the 40s, because I didn't have access to those, but just the ones like the short Tales of Suspense, where they would have the sleeper and the Red Skull, and they played a little bit more. They could introduce the bad guys being the Nazis, whereas today it's kind of, it's that thin line where you don't really cross that anymore, because the way culture seems to be now, it's very sensitive, and I understand that. I get it 100%. But it really is based in history.
Yeah,
it is. That's interesting, and I want to go back to what you had said about how you focused on the comic strips, and you at an early age wanted to be a comic strip artist, and then that eventually turned into you wanted to be a comic book artist. So talk about how, as a teenager, you got to work with guys like Bill Black and Bob McLeod, and paid your dues.
Yeah, I actually there was a convention simply called Orlando Con when I was young, and I found out about it. Maybe you guys remember this newspaper, the Comic Buyer's Guide.
Oh yeah.
And I'm trying to remember how I even found out about that, but I found out about it. I sent away for a sample copy. I got that. I think I started my subscription with issue 94, and that was like your news source. And that's where, you see, they would have a little bit of news features, whatever they could, but mostly it was advertising and stuff like that. But one of the other aspects I liked about it was they would showcase fan art on the cover of their paper. It was like a newspaper every week. And I did eventually, I think when I was around 17 or so, I sent in like 311 by 17 cover illustrations. I remember one was of the Spectre, one was Dead Man, and the third one, I can't remember. I was kind of in a Neil Adams phase thing. Right, that's why those characters. And I remember they rejected them, but they actually sent them back. But they sent them back to me like folded over and put in an 8.5 by 11 envelope.
Oh,
And so I was kind of like, oh, gee, thanks for sending my artwork back. You didn't keep it, but did you really have to fold it?
I know. Oh, that's horrible.
So, from there, it opened up, I started seeing, and I think that may have been where I saw the Cartoon Museum, which was run by, and, my friend Jim Ivey, who I think turned 96 this year. He's still up and around. And so he had this Orlando convention, and there were a lot of retired cartoonists in Florida. So he would have this guest list, and they had this little private banquet that you had to be invited to every year. And so I met a lot of people, and people that I admired, and saw a lot of people go through that show. So eventually, I can't remember when the first one was. I was probably 15. My parents drove me over for the day. They entertained that, and let me go in, and it was in an old Hojo.
Oh.
It was a hotel con, and so then the following year, I think my friend Craig Zablo and I'm not sure if it was still at the Howard Johnson's. It may have been. So we went that year. It was still a day, and then the next year, they decided to make it a 2-day show, I believe. So we wound up going over the day of the show, getting a room, spending the night, and doing the 2-day event. And from then on, it was, we got to know Jim Ivey. We would go over to his. It was a comic shop. It had original art and all that type of stuff, back issues. So I could, really just go through and look for back issues of stuff, which I had missed out on because I wasn't collecting comics. But also during that time leading up to that, I had started, my interest had shifted into the comic book medium. And so I was doing like most kids my age, every Saturday I would head out on my bike to maybe 5 or 6, maybe a bookstore, convenience stores, any place that I knew sold comics, used bookstores, try to find some back issues there. And, so I'd spend most of Saturday morning making the rounds and then getting home, a little bit after lunch and, sitting there and reading my comics.
Nice. So talk about how you worked with Bob McLeod.
Okay, so I met Bob at one of the Orlando conventions, and he wasn't an announced guest. I want to say I was 17 at the time that this happened. So I stopped by Bill Black's table because he was like the very first table when you walked in the door to the left, and he had this, display of all his prozines, fanzines, whatever you want to title them as. And I started a little conversation with him, and I actually had some samples in my portfolio that I brought along. And, so I showed my work to Bill, and he liked it. And, he's like, wow, would you be interested in doing some work? And I'm like, yeah, sure. And this was back in, boy, I can't remember the year, probably 77, 78. And so through, having that conversation with him, I think it was, again, goes back to my friend Craig Zablo. I think Craig Zablo overheard Bob talking to Jim Ivey, the guy that put the show on, stating like, hey, just wanted to introduce myself. I'm Bob McLeod, inker from Marvel Comics, blah, blah, blah. And then, Craig told me, he said, hey, Bob McLeod's here. And I had a vague knowledge of Bob. I don't know if he had inked the stuff that I think I first remember Bob. Well, he had inked some stuff. I think it was a Justice League or something over Jim Sherman at DC. But what I really noticed Bob's work for is when he inked Moon Knight, and this other story may have been a Star-Lord story over Bill Sienkiewicz in the black and white comics. So I went up and I started talking to Bob, and showed him my stuff. And he asked me where I was, from and stuff. And I told him Daytona Beach. And, I don't know how it got to the point where I started assisting him, where he felt like I was good enough or he was comfortable enough to like have me come over. So I would drive from East Coast to West Coast. And at first, Bob just started me out literally like erasing pages and maybe filling in some black areas, but not up to where the fine line stuff was, just, filling in the big black areas. And he would do the finesse type stuff so that I wouldn't, accidentally go in and cover something that wasn't supposed to be covered. So and then one time I was over there and I was like, oh, come on, Bob, let me rule some lines or something. I'm getting bored here. And so he did, and so we had that connection. It was actually Mike Zeck, though, who I met first.
Right.
I met him when I was 15 through a fan letter. Mike's work just kind of got on my radar through this two things: a used bookstore that had his Charlton comic books, and I don't know where the used bookstore was even getting them from, because they weren't being sold on any of the newsstands I went to. And these were actually used books too. They weren't like they were getting them as new. You could tell they were read. And so every time I saw that name Zeck or saw that style that I knew was his, I would pick that stuff up. And the second place was RBCC, Rockets Blast Comic Collector, which I got to know that through Comics Buyer's Guide. And so I would, I started ordering that back issues and stuff through the Comics Buyer's Guide. And I just, I gave it a shot. I wrote Mike a fan letter. Little did I know that Mike lived down in the South Florida area. The magazine was being published in Miami. And
for those who don't know, John was living in Florida at this time.
Yeah, I was still in Daytona Beach. So, and pretty much been here my whole life. I think 3 months. I was born in Kentucky, but I think my family, after 3 months, moved to the Daytona area. I was in Orlando for 10 years in the 90s. Then I moved back to Daytona. So, so it was weird. The actual address on the envelope from Mike said Hollywood. I saw Hollywood. I didn't know at 15 there was a Hollywood, Florida. So when I saw Hollywood, I was like, oh, great. He's in California, And then I saw the Florida and I'm like, this is odd. I don't know of no Hollywood, Florida. Where's this, And I found out. And so Mike and I corresponded a little bit through the mail. He had actually sent me Master of Kung Fu pencil pages that
very nice.
Yeah, that he had, completed, and it wasn't out yet. And so he gave me that as kind of some professional pencils to practice on. Wow. And I inked a few panels, sent them back, and he critiqued them. And, I was having both him and Bob, critique my work pretty regular. And so that, was a good thing. And eventually, I think this was one of those things where I think it was just when you could just look somebody up in call 411 and ask for a city and get their phone number.
Yeah, the yellow pages too. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I didn't have their yellow pages, so I had to actually call information. And it's kind of funny because the first call that I made, I was still, like I said, I was 15, maybe 16 by this time. You got to ask mom's permission or dad's permission, because it's not like today where you pay one fee and you can, it was like expensive to make a long distance.
Right. Yeah. The bill shows up and they're like, who made this call?
You called New York? What?
Yeah, exactly. And so I asked her, I said, hey, I want to call this guy Mike Zeck. It's going to be long distance. I was making some money doing some cartoons for a local publisher at the time. I said, when the phone bill comes in, I'll pay you, but I'm only going to be on 10, maybe 15 minutes, And so she's like, yeah, go ahead, And So I remember calling and asking for Mike, and this guy gets on the phone, and little did I know it was his dad. It's like, so I'm talking, you know, he's like, hello. And I'm like, Mike. And he's like, yeah. And I said, hey, this is John Beatty, calling you from Daytona Beach. And he's like, who?
What are you trying to sell?
Exactly. I said, it's me, John Beatty. I asked my mom if I could call you, and she said, yeah. So I hope you don't mind. And he's like, I don't know who you are. And I said, this is Mike Zeck, right? And he's like, yeah. And I said, okay, we've been writing each other, and I just figured I would call you. And then it dawned on his dad. He said, oh, you must mean Mikey. And so I said, well, is your son a comic book artist? He goes, yeah. He goes, let me get him for you. So there's where that kind of, and I was about ready to just say I must have the wrong number, because I thought maybe I had the wrong Mike Zeck, but that's not a very common name. So, from then we would still correspond through the mail. I would give him a call when I could. And then I remember it was kind of interesting. He disappeared for a few months, like 2 months or so. Hadn't heard from him, no letter. I'm like, well, don't know what happened. I didn't call to try to, bother anybody. So one night I got a phone call, and this person, it was kind of the opposite. Now someone's calling me saying, hey, it's Mike Zeck. And I'm like, no, it's not. He's like, yeah. I said, where have you been? He goes, oh, I moved to Connecticut. So he had about a couple month move where he was, going back and forth, moving stuff, and he just didn't have time for correspondence. But that's just the kind of guy Mike is, that he I guess he felt like he owed me a call. He gave me his number up there, and we had a nice conversation, and I'm sure Mike could afford a little more phone time. But it took a while, because then I felt like how his dad must have, when Mike's calling me and saying, yeah, it's Mike Zeck. And I'm like, no, this isn't Mike. It's like, I don't, who's pulling my leg,
Right, yeah. I can catch you off guard.
Exactly. It really did.
And then Mike basically helped encourage you and help you get your break into Marvel and DC, right? So that's how you get your foot in the door.
Right. Mike would always, after an issue came out, when he didn't need pencil copies, for anything, instead of throwing them away, he would always, he would make copy of his pencils before he turned them in. And he would send me the plot that Doug Minch was writing on Kung Fu, which was a sizable plot. And then I could also see where he would take the paragraphs and kind of circle what was going to be a page, and then break that down, on the plots. And then he would send me Xeroxes of the penciled pages. And sometimes there would even be original, like, cover roughs and stuff in there, which was nice. So it was great, and it's like, so I had these pencils that were professional level pencils, instead of just my attempt at drawing, so that I could kind of work on something that was at a professional level, and help polish my work and improve it maybe a little quicker than if I was struggling, working on, like I said, trying to do my drawing and inking at the same time, which I did. But it's one of those things where nowadays I think it might be a little easier to do the penciling and inking due to all the easy reference. But back in my day, when you had to reference something, you were out at libraries looking for books, or bookstores. You had to have an extensive physical library, whereas today you don't really need that.
And so shortly thereafter, I mean, we're talking within a couple of years max, Mike's starting on Captain America. He leaves Master of Kung Fu. He goes over to Captain America. And with issue 262, you help him out on the cover.
Right.
And then with 265, that's the first time that the two of you did the interiors for Captain America. And this went on for a couple dozen issues between 1982 and 1984. Because then you went on to Mike's work on Secret Wars when he left, right?
Right.
The Secret Wars miniseries, and then the year later, the Punisher miniseries and more. And you still work on commissions with him to this day. It isn't often to see a penciler inker partnership like this. So what is it about working with Mike that's lasted 40 years?
That's a good question. That's a real good question. I, I think since I've known Mike since I was at such a young age, he was like the big brother I never had.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that kind of, Mike had no brother. He's the middle kid. He's also the only son. I'm the middle kid. I'm also the only son. So I don't know, if there's anything to be said for that, but, Mike has always been a great person to everyone he's met. It's like he's always encouraged people, like at a convention or something, somebody will come up and he'll give them tips on their portfolio and stuff. Used to be that was, what a lot of people came to shows for. But, now with the internet and stuff, you can get your work out there. So it's not as prevalent.
Mm-hmm.
But Mike and I just kind of, his family became mine. My family kind of became his. He stayed here in Daytona at my place while he was, actually doing some Secret Wars work. I had stayed down at his family's house during the Miami cons, which is where Shooter and a lot of people would go. And that's where, that's where I first met Jim Shooter, was at a Miami convention. And I know he was the guy that could actually hire you to do a job. And so, Mike and I have just remained friends more than anything over the years. And as we still work together when we do conventions, we still have good communication. We'll discuss a sketch, and if Mike has an idea, or if he, wants to say, like, I'm going to play around with this a little bit more. So, I'm not sure if I'm going to make it black. Let's think about it or something, we still have this really good communication between us. And, I really don't know what it is. I mean, there's so many people that have worked together in the business that they don't want to be at the same show as each other, let alone sitting right next, elbow to elbow, that Mike and I do. We finish each other's stories at conventions, or, we say the same stuff at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some sort of, I don't know what to call it, but there's some sort of synergy that Mike and I have that I'm happy for it, because, Mike's been really a good friend and I'll call him a brother to me, mentor, whatever, all the other words that you could use to describe somebody important in your life.
Yeah.
He's been that sounding board for me. So it's been a good journey, and I look forward to a lot more time with Mike too.
Yeah, I have to say it's been one heck of a partnership. I mean, later, I mean, I got my start with Captain America 286.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's when I started reading Cap on a regular basis, and I haven't stopped since. So it's been, ever since then. But the interesting thing is, now that I've gotten older and I have the ability to get original art, I look at some of these pages, and I own a few pages that both you and Mike worked on in Cap. I recently got a page from 265, which was the first issue you two did together.
Yep.
And I also have a couple other pages, and I could totally see, maybe I'm biased, but I look at the work that you did with Mike, and I compare it to some of the other inkers before you came on board with Mike, and there's a distinct difference.
Right.
And I mean, I'm right now looking at my wall, and there's a page from 259 and a page from 287, and your work on it is just is so distinctive as far as it's just complementary.
Right.
It doesn't look like, I don't know how to describe it, but it's been one heck of a partnership for sure.
Well, and truthfully, that was one of the things I think that kind of worked in my favor to a degree during that period of time when Mike was getting into the business. It was basically, they just gave a book to whoever needed an inking job. Somebody came in and was looking for work and they had pencils, they could walk away with it. There was, people that were called, so-called teams and stuff that were working on the same book month in, month out. They were probably, distant. They probably didn't have communication like Mike and I did. So, Mike kind of jokes around that, I was his hand-picked inker and he could, kind of groom me to ink how he wanted me to. But which there's some truth into that because, like I said, I always respect, whatever penciler I'm working with and what they put down, and I don't want to just haphazardly change anything that's not necessary. But with Mike, it was like, his pencils at that time, they were, they weren't like the pencils you see people produce today, where it's literally so tight, inking is really not a necessity. So Mike and I, that's a great example right there. Mike and I really kind of, like I said, we would talk jobs over, talk pages over. If I had a question, and I happened to be up at his place or whatever, I could say, "Hey, Mike, I don't understand what you're trying to do here," and he might sketch it out in a marker or something, kind of give me a little art direction or something, or explain it better, or just tell me, "Oh, this is some, I'd be like, what is this weird shadow you got here?" And Mike would go, "Oh, that's some reflected light coming from this," and just give me kind of, a point of, I don't understand it. Again, explain it to me, and he would take that time to do it. He just wouldn't blow it off as like, you should know this stuff. It's like, if I didn't know something, I didn't feel bad, addressing the problem and going, "Okay, I'm confused here with what you drew. I can't figure it out."
Sure.
So I think the communication has a lot to do with building not only a trust relationship, but a quality relationship. And that was one thing that Mike and I tried to always do, is our best quality. Now, having said that, I will say, yes, we had deadlines thrown upon us that, you'll see some pieces that are great and some pieces that are really rushed out. And those are the ones that we don't like to see. But you know what? In the big scheme of thing, that's history.
Sure.
That's just the way it is for everybody. I mean, I don't know anyone who hasn't had jobs they've had to just rush out. So
Yeah.
It's going to happen. Well, I don't know. These days, it seems like if you take 3 months to complete one issue, they don't care. Back in the Bronze Age of the 80s, man, if you were late, you could lose your job. You could be kicked off the book.
Right.
So you kind of, needed to get the work done, whether you got sleep, whether you stayed up, for a week straight to finish something, no matter what, you got that job in, or you might be looking for something else.
Yeah. Hey, John, going back to your time with Mike on Captain America, you started out with the David Anthony Kraft 2-part story. And
Right.
Of course, David has unfortunately passed away not too long ago. But that story featured Spider-Man and Nick Fury. And then you were part of some amazing stories by Dave Matisse.
Right.
Are there any issues that stand out as particularly memorable or sentimental or favorites to you?
Well, that's a tough one, because I haven't really reread this stuff in a long time, even though the reprint collection just came out. But it's kind of interesting because I feel lucky that during that period that Mike and I were working on the book, we did get to work with the classic Cap villains, like the Red Skull, and Baron Zemo, and I'm thinking of I'm trying to remember the covers with all this stuff on it, but sometimes we just did like the action pose Captain America cover.
Yeah.
But I know we got to work on some of the classic villains, and then we got to work on some stuff that was kind of thrown our way, like Team America, the motorcycle thing, which this was some deal I think that Marvel had made, that they were gonna use them in a book, and Team America, it only seemed logical to the people upstairs that they debuted before they got their own comic in Captain America.
Right.
So that was not a fun issue for Mike and I to do.
Yeah, we actually had J.M. DeMatteis on, and he talked about that, how that was, I think, one of two times that something was forced on him. I think the other time was licensing was about to go out on something called the Defenders of World War II, and so he had to throw them into like a newsreel.
Right.
But other than that, he said, they let him pretty much tell whatever story he wanted. So but yeah, those are funny examples.
Oh yeah, and I remember now, speaking of JM, it's like there's the first appearance and maybe the creation of Vermin, which later came back, of course, in Craven's Last Hunt, which Bob inked. I didn't, but it's got that that tie in there. And also I think the storyline that most people get connected to is the one with Deathlock in it.
Sure.
So again, that was another character that I liked growing up. So, we got to work on him, and, some of those covers, I think the first one was 278.
For Deathlock.
Yeah.
286.
286, where he's got Cap in his sights, and
yes,
that's still like, today people come up, oh, that's my favorite cover, and usually when I'm asked what is my favorite Cap cover, besides probably Cap Annual #8, I really like, there it is.
Can you see it?
Yeah. I really like the quiet cover of, I think it's 284, where I don't think Mike and I did the interior. It's Cap on a ledge with just looking down at the city and the flags below him. It's a very quiet cover, but I don't know. There's something about that cover that is very relaxing, and yet, I don't want to say exciting, but just makes you think,
Right. Yeah. It's a different pose for Captain America. It's almost like a Daredevil or a Batman pose, right?
Right. Yeah. But it just really works. It's real subtle, but man, when it hits you, it just, it's nice.
Yeah.
So after you and Mike left Cap to do Secret Wars, and then the Punisher miniseries, Mike came back to do covers for Cap, and then you came back and you inked interiors for a handful of issues.
Right.
Now Paul Neary was the penciler at the time, and I know you just said, no matter who you worked on, you wanted to be respectful of their style. Was inking Paul a challenge after inking Mike for so many years at that point? And how do they compare when it comes to inking them?
Well, there's two big differences. One was Paul Neary was basically doing more or less breakdowns instead of finished pencils. So I was, finishing them. But the second, I don't know if it's a problem, but the second thing that popped up around this time was, and I've got no beef with Jim Shooter. We get along fine now. But Jim got on this kick where if you have solid black in the foreground, you can't have black in the background because you're going to lose the field of depth. I don't agree with that theory, because I see Al Williamson doing, I look at his work and I see black in the foreground, black in the midground, black in the background, reads fine to me. But if you look at that work that I did there, a lot of it seems very simplistic. And that was because Jim had kind of, I thought I was going to escape the lecture. He was given, he was pulling people into his office, and he would pull out a job. I won't mention what job it was, but he would go over it and he would say, this is not good. And this is why. I don't want to see you doing this in your inking. If you have black on the character in the foreground, don't give me a black in the background. And I even said something about, okay, so if there's a black silhouette in the foreground, and let's say Nick Fury or somebody else with a black costume or something is in the background, you're saying just leave it open? Yes, leave it open for color. That's their job. Yeah, I just didn't, So the work that I did over Neary was probably not hurried, but it was not to the level that I would have wanted it to be. And there's a whole lot of other stuff that kind of played into why I didn't stay on the book long, but that's kind of behind the scenes politics stuff. So we'll just leave that out,
Okay. Well, let's talk more artistic stuff then. So,
okay.
because you mentioned that you were finishing for Paul Neary. So
Right.
now we've had inker Joe Rubenstein on the show, and he shared some insight on the difference between inking and finishing pieces. And so for our newer listeners, can you talk about the difference and where you were finishing for Paul Neary? What's the difference between inking and finishing for those who aren't aware?
Well, it will vary from depending on the penciler you're working with. Some pencilers breakdowns or layouts or when you're finishing for them are a little bit tighter than other artists, so they all have their own level of what they would consider layouts or breakdowns that the inker would then finish. Basically, what you want to see is the drawing, the storytelling. Usually the penciler won't spot blacks. That's up to the inker. So, you have to make decisions. And sometimes, I would sometimes take a photocopy of the page, take a Sharpie out, kind of, spot blacks before I committed it to a page. So the biggest difference is when you get so-called finished pencils, the penciler has pretty much figured out, the shadows, the rendering, all that type of stuff, the details. And when you're doing finishes, it's up to you to make sure everything is lit from the same light source, or, if you're going to have split lighting or something. So in that case, for me, I always like to, it was great when you had lettering on the board, because you could actually read the story and follow what was going on. If you don't have lettered boards, you're kind of lost in the story. So sometimes you didn't catch the mood of the story. A lot of pencilers, layout stuff, they might let you know if it's a night scene. So then you would light it and ink it different than you would if it's noon, So yeah, the difference is, it's a matter of it's a matter of level of what work an inker puts into it on their own versus what's already there for your interpretation. At least that's the way I like to look at it. Like I said, I don't really like to change much on a penciler to overpower their style. I like to try to retain what I like about their style and just give it a finished look, that they don't obtain in pencil. But like I said, a lot of the people, probably most of the pencilers in the business these days, I think they learn, a lot of them learn to draw from looking at the finished inked product. So I think they felt pencils had to look like they were already inked. And that's why if you've ever seen pencils that haven't been inked, you'll notice that, man, I mean, they're etched in the paper and there's no there's not a lot of room for interpretation, if any at all.
Mhm. So it's interesting, you know, as far as the art, the whole process right
Mhm.
behind it. There's certain things like I'm learning. So I got this page here from Captain America 276,
Okay.
which you and Mike worked on, right?
Right.
And if you look here at this in the shadows
Mhm.
behind, right, they have zipatone.
Right.
And so I'm just learning this, but zipatone, can you tell us what that is and how that works? And is that something that you put on, or is it something someone else does?
That would be something I would do. Um, Basically what it is, and I guess you can still get it, but back then they actually, I think it was made by Letraset. It was actually called Zipatone. It would be a low tack sheet of dots or some sort of pattern um, that you would use in that instance. It creates that little bit of illusion of more depth behind Steve Rogers coming out of the doorway, where
Mhm.
you don't want a solid black, but you want a darker color. So in theory, when that gets turned into the colorist, if they just put the same color over top of the Zipatone, that color is going to tone down and it's not going to be black. It's going to be like a shade of gray. So it's going
Got
to be
it.
it's going to be like a different value.
Yeah, that's really cool. That's interesting. Thank you for explaining that.
Yeah.
Um, so we have a few questions from our listeners. So we'll ask just a few of those to finish things up here. But Grant Ball wants to learn more about your philosophy behind being an inker, and what makes someone a good inker.
Well, I don't really think I can ink that. I don't think I can ink that. The answer is no. That's a tough thing to answer because again, I think it goes back to personal taste. And I mean, there are things that you you know you have to consider what makes somebody good at something. What makes them stand out. Uh, but in the big picture, I mean, I know that everybody doesn't like my work. It's like that's just part of reality, and you can't please everybody. So, what I try to do is in my work is I try to make it, let's just, say attractive, I guess, to the eye. So it's pleasing and that people can understand and read it well, and that it works over different pencilers. So there's kind of like this, I kind of feel that you have a style that you develop while you're in the business. And when you're working for Marvel, DC, or maybe even, somebody else in the publishing business, they expect that style out of you. If you suddenly do a 90-degree change of what they're used to seeing, eh, you know, you get called a lot of names and stuff, so it's like once you establish a certain look or style, like people have referred to me, and it's fine, as a super clean and a tight inker, and that's kind of what I was going for. I personally love loose, illustrative, uh, uh interpretive inking, but it's hard for me to bring myself to do it, because number one, I know what people expect when they see my name, when they know I'm going to be on a project, they would know what they're going to get from my work. Tight, clean, precise inking, you know?
Mhm.
And so that's what I tried to do. Now, the few times I did experiment off of that, I would hear usually through a third party later on down the road that the editor hated that job I turned in. And it may have just been a one issue thing. There was other times where I would get a job and I would talk to the penciler, or maybe they would, get a hold of me and say, hey, I like what you do, but could you roughen it up a bit? And I'm sure, hey, if that's the direction you want me to do, I can definitely roughen it up, so like I said, it's all kind of a popularity contest. It's like, who's the best penciler, you ask 10 people, you might get 80% all saying the same thing, or you might get 10 different answers, so it's really hard to say. Like I said, I guess I'll repeat myself and just say it's like, what attracted me to Mike Zeck's work when I was a kid, you know it was certain things he did over and over and over, that drew me to like really love looking at his work. So kind of the same answer with your question there is yeah, I mean, there's certain guidelines, where stuff has, you can tell a professional quality job versus a amateur job pretty easy.
Sure.
Now when you get into independent comics, I think that's wide open. They can get away with stuff that, Marvel and DC is going to look at and go, how can we fit this into what we do? And that's where I don't, it's kind of like, it's a fine line, I think there is room for all different styles. It's like when Bill Sienkiewicz started experimenting, it's like a lot of people were like, what happened? What's going on here?
Right.
But now you look at Bill's stuff and you're like, wow, it's like me and Kirby. I didn't get it right away. It took me a while to understand Kirby. Now I look at stuff that Kirby did and I'm like, wow, that just, knocks my socks off.
Yeah. Well, hey, we got another question from a listener, Joshua Daniel Van Dyne. He wonders why you worked on Cap so long. Was it something about the character, or was it just the fact that you liked working with Mike Zeck?
It was both. Mike's favorite character is also Captain America, and Mike actually started. I think Mike did 3 years on the book, and I did 2.5. When he got on the book, there was a contract signed with some inkers to ink half a year, and
Frank McLaughlin, I believe, right?
Well, they
Draw
had
Studios,
a studio, and it was I can't remember what they called it. But yeah, Frank was kind of heading it up, and so I had to wait for their contract to expire because Mike, I was getting professional work from Marvel and DC, and that's when I actually started the Justice League. I got a call to do that monthly, and I kind of didn't want to take it, but I knew it was going to be a while before I could take over Cap, so
yeah, but you're inking George Perez. I mean, come on.
I know. And the funny thing about that is I got a call. I wasn't home. My mom took a note. Seems like my mom did a lot.
Your mom had a big role here.
Yeah. And so I'm trying to remember. It was Karen Berger. She was Lynn Wean's assistant. So she called me, left a message. I got home where it was around 7:30. I didn't know. I went ahead and called back. She was still in the office. And I think this was a Thursday or Friday night. And she said, oh yeah, I was calling because, we've been looking at your work you've been doing here, and we need an inker on Justice League over George Perez. And we wanted to know if you'd be interested in inking it. And I was like, well, yeah, sure. And I said, don't send any pages because I had already planned a trip to come up. I had my plane ticket and everything the Monday after the weekend. So I said, I'll tell you what, I will see you Monday and pick up the pages in person. So the trip was already planned. It was that fate call, like,
yeah,
hey, you want to do this? And yeah, sure. I'll, don't even send them. I'll come up and get them.
That's
So
perfect.
yeah, it was great. Now the hard part was when it was time to leave the book. I had never quit a book before, so I didn't know how. If you want me to tell the story, I will. It was kind of fun.
Yeah. Oh, we'd love
Yeah,
to hear it.
definitely.
Sure.
Let me hear that one.
Yeah,
So
here's a young guy getting into the business, inking George Perez on DC's
Justice
flagship
League.
title, and saying, "I got to go." So
Yeah,
yeah, we got to hear this.
I'm going to ink Mike Zeck on Captain America. um, so yeah, so the 6 month period, came and went, and I think I did 4 issues over George. So I knew I had to clear that book. I had to get rid of it so I could ink Cap. So I'm really nervous. It's like I didn't know what to say, didn't know what to do. But as I was getting closer to finishing up the book, I'm like, I have to let them know so they can find somebody else. I don't want to leave them hanging. So I call up Len Wein, and this is back when editors actually answered their phones and would have a talk with you. And so I got a hold of Len, and I told him, I said, Len, I said, I got a call from Marvel. They want me to ink Captain America over Mike Zeck. And I kind of threw this in thinking it would help because I didn't know what else to do. I said, and they're offering me a better page rate. Yeah. So I figured, like,
Was that true?
Oh yes, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, yes and no. DC was giving me a whole $5 more for doing breakdowns, inking. George, what he turned in was basically breakdowns, but George, there was more there. He was one of the guys that would put more in on his breakdowns than some people would on their finished pencils.
Yes.
Especially back in that time. So with the $5 more, it was maybe DC was really paying me like 50 cents more per page. Mm-hmm. But the actual page rate was more. So, and it was 30, I think Marvel was offering me $32 or $35 a page. At DC, I was $27.50 with the $5 for finishes. I think it's been long enough I can tell those rates.
Yeah.
And kind of put things into perspective.
Right. 40 years later. Yeah.
It does. Yeah. Jeez.
Yeah. $32 or $35 a page. I think it was 32 actually, because that would make the 50 cents more over at DC.
That's 1981 money.
Yeah, exactly. And so it was like I realized that was the wrong approach, because I had already told Mike yes, and Lynn said, did you give them an answer yet? And I was like, no. And he's, I was kind of panicking, so it came out no. And he's like, let me get right back to you. I need to talk to some people. Click. And I thought, oh God, what have I done? Lynn's gonna go get me at least a higher rate or match the rate. And then what's my excuse for leaving? Except I just got to go. Captain America is my favorite cover. I get a chance to ink Mike Zeck full time. Got to go, buddy. Thanks for going to bat to me. But
yeah,
right.
So,
what happened? What did Len say?
He called back and he said, he goes, I got you a little bit of a bump, but it's not going to meet Marvel. We can't go that high, which seems kind of funny now, right? Mm-hmm. We can't go that high. He goes, so, and this is when I could finally relax. He goes, so if you really need to take that book, I totally understand. And man, you talk about pressure being.
Yeah.
I mean, when he just let me off that easy, like, hey, I understand if and I said, well, yeah, I said, I still got to finish the book I'm working on now, the last one. And I said, but, I really want to ink Captain America and work with Mike Zeck. And that was
the rest
pretty
is
much
history.
That was history.
Boy, I'll tell you. But I, like I said, that's not how you quit a book.
Yeah.
You just tell them it's time to move on. It's like you got an offer you'd rather work on. And hey, believe me, had it had I not had this relationship with Mike and this had not happened, I would have been content inking George on Justice League for a long time.
Sure. Yeah, who wouldn't?
Right. Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, so it wasn't, I mean, it was an easy decision, but when you look back at it, it's like, how did you give that up? And I'm like, well, without Mike Zeck, I wouldn't even be inking George probably,
Right.
So
Wow. I'm glad you shared that story with us. It's pretty funny.
it is.
And we have one final question from the listeners, and that is
Okay.
Stephen Penipede. He wants to know, how are you doing after your eye surgery? Because we actually had on the Captain America Facebook group, we had your GoFundMe page, and number one, and number two, has that changed how you work at the drawing board?
Yes. It went fine, except I didn't know about this what they call YAG. It's something that I guess the best thing I can describe it as some sort of like spider web stuff grows over the lenses, the plastic lenses that they put in your eyes. And normally 30% of the people that have the surgery get it. So it has to be lasered off. I had to live with it from when I got my surgery done last year until the beginning of this year. And then they had to do one eye at a time. And so I was still dealing with it. And, it helped a little bit, but my distance vision and mid vision is fine, but my close-up vision, which this is really interesting. The panoptic lenses I got are 3 depths lenses, and they can't guarantee that you'll have your close-up vision, but they can guarantee mid-range and far away. So right now, the biggest struggles for me are light sensitivity, which I heard is, because when you have cataracts, you're all clouded up, and it got to the point where my night driving, luckily I knew the roads around where I live, because it's not safe to drive when all the lights just look like, you're in a heavy downpour, So yeah, as far as vision, I don't need glasses for distance or mid-range or anything like that. That's the good part. The bad part is I still have light sensitivity, which does, I mean, underneath the drawing table with the lights, it's kind of hard. And I do need to wear a pair of readers when I'm like actually inking or drawing, just for the close-up work. And I'll tell you this, it's interesting because I'm not used to I'm used to having, as maybe you have seen at conventions, you'll see someone working on a drawing and their nose is like almost on the drawing board, they're up close. And that's how I was for a long, long time. You get that way, but you become accustomed to it. So now when I do a signature, or if I'm doing something, if I pull back a little bit, it's okay. But, my nature is to lean forward. So I haven't broke that habit because I've done it for so many years. So yeah, I mean, the light sensitivity, I asked about that, and they basically just said, you will eventually adjust to it. There's no timeline, so these bright, sunny Florida days, not that we're having them now, but when we do have them, man, I got to wear sunglasses, or, it's so bright outside. And even my desk lamps, when I'm drawing, it's like I can turn them down lower now and get enough light in my eye to see. And a pair of readers, which aren't very strong, I think I use the 1.25. So I think just the 1.00, the lowest you can go or whatever. And then I found that the 1.25 works fine for me.
Well, we wish you a speedy recovery and a full recovery. because I know you spend a lot of time with the board. You do a lot of commission work.
Right.
I was very excited to get a cap piece from you and Zeck in 2019.
Mhm.
And you also do pencil ink commissions as well
Right.
as cover recreations.
Mhm.
Our listeners, I encourage you to check out John's work at his website, which is johnbeattyart.com. And what else do you have going on currently, or anything coming up?
Well, conventions are coming back slowly, so I've got a few shows planned for the rest of the summer and into the fall. I've got a couple of bigger commissions that I will start working on, and then I also actually have some commissions left over from last year that I still need to complete. So, it's just a mixed bag of stuff, and I'm trying to narrow down what I do. I'm trying to get back onto some sort of a semi-regular YouTube or maybe Twitch stream, because I think in 2018 I started doing because I get up early, but I had an office then, and COVID kind of made it impossible for me to keep that, so I'm back home. And so I get up at 4 o'clock, and I would be down there, and with my son being in school too, that causes another, can't really get the early start, because got to get him off to school. Either my wife or we drive him and pick him up. So, but I for a while was starting a live stream, just doing a warm up drawing every morning for it's 7 o'clock in the morning, So I was an extremely early streamer, which I don't mind, but I can't fit that into a workable schedule here at the house.
That's hard.
Yeah. Well, we'll certainly keep an eye out for that. And if you do have any Captain America or Cap related commissions, we certainly hope that you post them in the Captain America Comic Book Fans Facebook group, because we know you're a member there. So please share them there so we can all appreciate them.
Okay.
And John, it's been a real pleasure chatting with you. So, and we appreciate you coming on the show and sharing some stories about your early work and your time on Cap. So thank you for being on the show.
Yeah. Thanks again. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Well, that was a fun conversation with John. He took us down some fun stories behind the scenes, and of course, the more and more we ever hear about Mike Zeck, he just sounds like a true gentleman.
He does.
A great guy, helping various people out in the industry. And how about that story, with Jim Shooter taking him into the office, getting called into the principal's office,
Right. I gotta wonder what, that just doesn't come out of nowhere, right? I mean, that was precipitated by some piece of art that maybe set Jim off, that he didn't I'm not saying something that Zeck or Beatty worked on, but something else must have stood out as like an egregious example of that, where it was just like, I just can't take that anymore. Hey, look, the thing is, John shared a lot of great stories, a lot of details. And, we've had this discussion before offline, and I think even online, where sometimes some guests are like, you're like, so what's your philosophy of, XYZ? And they're like 7. And that's the answer, right? You can't pull anything out of that.
Yes. And we had 1 or 2 of those here on the show.
Right. Yeah. That was not a problem today.
Not a problem. No, John was a great guest, and we enjoyed having him on, and enjoyed continuing the conversation here and there on the Captain America Comic Book Fans Facebook group. So if you haven't been on there, check it out. We've got, more and more, we're over 4,000 now. So it's great, and it's growing, and people are, the content is great, and the conversation is great. So we love that. All right, Bob. Well, as always, it's been fun wrapping Cap with you.
It has. Until next time.
All right. Until then, I'm Rick Verbanis. He's Bob Lucius. And you've been listening to the Captain America Comic Book Fans Podcast.